Another round of applause for Jen. Woo. I was living the young, single professional life in downtown Chicago with no car. I needed to figure out a way to Michigan so I could go to my 10-year class reunion. I didn't bat an eye when somebody said, hey, why don't you call Dan? Now, Dan and I met the first day of camp when we were 8 years old. We went to camp together every year, and he was in love with my best friend, and I was in love with his, Bobby Nelson. I spent years in love with Bobby Nelson, so we never dated. Dan was my safe friend. We went on a million youth group trips. He took me to a prom. I lost track of him after college. Well, I called him up and I told him about the reunion and I asked if he had plans to go home. He could swing through Chicago on the way and pick me up. He gave a heck yeah, and only after I hung up did I think, I just invited a now stranger to stay in my home. My roommate swore she would never leave me alone with him, so I made a plan. I was gonna stay somewhere in public with him until she got home from work. Killing time. Now, I recognized him when he walked up the street, but he was no longer a scrawny teenager. He was a man. I took him to Navy Pier where we waited for my roommate, who never showed. The conversation, though, it was easy that night. As the sun set on Lake Michigan, the lake was sparkly, the lights were sparkly. There was a swing band playing and people dancing. Our road trip north was just like old times. He even came to my class reunion with me. And over the next few months, we somehow found ways to see each other several more times. And when he finally kissed me, he told me he was gonna marry me. And the truth was, we fell in love that night on Navy Pier. And 5 years later, he took me back to that exact spot to propose. And of course, we got married at camp. Of course we did. Now, we lived a beautiful life together for almost 20 years in Nashville. Now, Dan was always a little bit sick and tired, but with his fast food diet and late night gig schedule as a working musician, I didn't think much of it. Until one Sunday afternoon, I came home and found him collapsed on the floor. This started an entire season of endless misdiagnoses and perpetual life and death crisis after crisis in and out of the hospital. First, it was a weird meningitis, then dozens of mini strokes. He inexplicably went fully blind. His kidneys failed when they gave him too much high-power antibiotics. So much went wrong. And 4 years later, he died. I lost my person. I lost the life that I thought I had, my future, and my whole childhood. We knew 1,000 versions of each other over 40 years. It took a week for it to dawn on me I was a widow. I took off my wedding rings because whether I liked it or not, I was no longer married. Everything gets weird when you have a dead person. 48 hours after Dan died, someone I'd never even gone to lunch with texted at 4 a.m. to tell me that they would like to come over for a visit. I mean, random people showed up at all hours of day and night. Sometimes to drop off flowers or a pie or yard art, all unannounced. 387,000 conversations that started with "I'm sorry," followed by inappropriate questions. And they could happen at any time and at any place. Like 5 minutes before I was gonna get on stage. You see, I was a national speaker and I was back to work just 10 days after Dan died. I had $1 million of medical debt. I had a 6-figure problem with the IRS. And I still had to make payroll. I was standing backstage waiting to be introduced, and someone approached me in tears, wanting to know if Dan died at the hospital or at home. It was so hard trying to make everyone else feel better all the time. No one was ready for my old life to end, and my every move was studied and questioned like I didn't know my own mind. I ran away to my parents' cottage in Fife Lake many times over that first fall and winter, just to get a break. And I had a lot of time to think about this unwelcome, sucky future. I was broke, I didn't have children, Nashville was too big, I knew I couldn't afford my house long term. How the fire was I even gonna take care of myself? Not if, but when I got sick or old. I started to think maybe I could eventually swindle my siblings out of this cottage. Could I scrape together a cheap retirement and actually live in Fife Lake someday after spending 30 years in big cities in the South? I decided I needed to test my idea and spend the summer there. Now, I kept a low profile for the first few weeks, but on the 4th of July, I woke up full of dread. Now, my parents' house, they hosted a party every year with dozens of people, some of which I knew and some of which I didn't, but they all knew me and they all knew my story. And there was no escape from a bunch of I'm sorries and tough questions. Ed beelined straight over to me at the party. My parents invited his extended family every year, and they said he always shows up even though he only said about 3 words the whole time. Ed was a super shy, 50-year-old confirmed bachelor. I hadn't seen him since maybe we were 12-ish. He said he noticed on Facebook I was interested in an event at the Headlands Dark Sky Park. He volunteered there. He suggested I go up with him sometime as he could get me better parking. That seemed like a lot, but I thought I might look for him if I ever went up. So a few days later, he texted me an actual invitation. Now, to keep sane that first year, I had one rule. I gave myself permission to opt out of every single social event unless it was outside. According to my own rule, I had to begrudgingly say yes to his invite. It was going to be painfully awkward, but thankfully at the last second, a friend came with me. Turned out, Ed was a charming host. He took us on a lovely tour all along the way. One of our stops was at a park along the Inland Waterway. There was a raft on a cable system that wheeled out to this little island with gazebo. And so I walked out to the end of the dock to hop on the raft and promptly dropped my phone, which disappeared in the deep muck of the lake. Oh well. Ed hauled us out to the island. I took 3 steps out onto the floating boardwalk and promptly face planted. I was so shocked, it took me a second to figure out if I was even hurt. I was bloody and now muddy from head to toe. On the way back from the island, the raft got stuck halfway back. We tried everything to get unstuck before we had to call 911. I figured I had cursed this outing and told them, just call me Jonah and throw me over. Really. Ed was a surprisingly good sport. He kept us cool and he was a good problem solver. I made note that he'd probably say yes to future shenanigans should I move up here. Ed initiated several more adventures over the course of the next few weeks. They were all outside, so I had to keep saying yes. And I had clumsy mishaps on every single one of them. But the worst week of the year was approaching. Dan's birthday and his 1-year death anniversary both fell in the first week of August. It didn't feel safe to go it alone, but who do you ask to be with you in such an awful state? The previous plans I had made for what would have been my wedding anniversary didn't go so great, even with my safe people. And I feared this was going to be way worse. Ed had been lovely, discreet, he wasn't overly dramatic. I emailed him and he responded that it might be a perfect time to go explore the other side of the state, which would, quote, leave us free to see what kind of emotional and meteorological conditions would present. He never pitied me. He never offered false comfort. It was like he knew there was no comfort in grief. Now, while exploring a new beach a few days later, Ed announced he wanted to have a serious conversation. My heart stopped. Was this a define the relationship speech? Does he think we're dating? I got all flustered and weird, and I told him I didn't know how to behave with him. But that was not at all the conversation he was starting. He shared his up north bachelor retirement strategy. I was mortified and relieved. Dating was never on the table. Being a fresh widow and a confirmed bachelor, truthfully, neither of us ever thought we'd ever marry anyone ever. But my misunderstanding made me think about him all week. Ed was a third engineer, a third farmer, and a third poet. He was profoundly respectful of me and my grief. And there was an ease between us. And much to my surprise, I could see a life with him. And apparently, that conversation made him think about it too. Because that weekend, he kissed me, and suddenly we were dating. No one was more shocked than we were. We were instantly serious, but I figured we'd date long distance for a couple years to give us time to get used to it. I had a lot of big problems to solve. I went back to Nashville after Labor Day, determined to start cleaning up my old life. I hired a junk service to come clear out my garage as my first step. Some random guy saw the truck and knocked on my door to see if I was going to sell my house. I let him and his wife walk through, and they made an offer. I called Ed. He didn't even hesitate. Do it, move here. It was a huge decision because we both knew if I sold that house, I'd never be able to buy another one due to my financial situation. We didn't consult anyone. More like we announced our plans. Many of my friends worried. It was so soon. Should I be selling my house? Were we that serious? Does anyone even know this guy? Ed's friends worried too. I mean, I didn't look good on paper. I gave away 95% of everything I owned. I packed the rest and headed north. I arrived September the 30th. Do the math. I paid off the IRS, and a few months later, I went to declare bankruptcy, only to find all of the creditors missed their filing deadline, and my debt disappeared. I basically won $1 million lottery. Whoa. Ed proposed in the last minute of winter on the equinox, and our engagement ushered in the first minute of spring. We got married in a cherry orchard in full bloom, and this May will be our 5th wedding anniversary. Ed says Dan never even met the Jennifer Way that he fell in love with. He says he's grateful Dan loved the old Jen Way, so he had a chance to love this one.